You're listening to the Cultivating Careers in Alternative Proteins podcast, a podcast which features students and early career professionals who work in the alternative protein industry, where they discuss their journeys and deliver advice on how you can start a career in this revolutionary field. One of the most obvious and highly needed roles in the alternative protein industry is bioengineering, specifically in the cultivated meat sector. This is because bioengineering is extremely useful for cell scaffolding, tissue structuring, cell growth factor optimization, as well as bioreactor design and bioprocess design. As such, it's long overdue that I showcase someone who is in this role on the podcast. This episode's guest, Anirvan Guha, is the Head of Formulations at Multus, a London-based company that develops custom ingredients and growth media for cultivated meat companies. He has a master's in biomedical engineering from the University of Michigan and a PhD in physics from the University of Fribourg in Switzerland. Anirvan's work on designing artificial systems that mimic nature has been published in top scientific journals such as Nature and Advanced Materials. And now he is using that experience to help serve the cultivated meat industry. Alright, on to my interview with Anirvan, where he shares the story of his transition to the alternative protein industry and how he has thrived in it. Hello, Anirvan, and welcome to the Cultivating Careers and Alternative Proteins podcast. I'm really stoked to have you on the show today and hearing about your background and experiences.
Thanks, Jeffrey. I'm really excited to be here as well.
Awesome. All right, then. We'll dive right into it then. But maybe let's start at the beginning. Why did you really decide to study bioengineering in the first place?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think like a lot of people going into university, I wasn't entirely sure where I really wanted to end up. Before college, I was pretty interested in sciences and engineering. So in a way, once I sort of learned about bioengineering as a topic, it seemed like a pretty natural fit. I guess what especially appealed to me about it was this idea of using sort of technical or scientific approaches to help solve some of humanity's greatest challenges. There were many other topics that I felt like I could potentially thrive in and find somewhat interesting, but might not have the global impact that I really wanted out of my career. Back then, I mostly envisioned putting my skills to use in some sort of like medical device company, though where I ended up is actually quite a bit different. I sort of went down the scientific route instead.
All right. And are you happy with the path that you eventually ended up taking?
Yeah, absolutely. It's not ever really a straight line or what you expect, but if I look back at all the different experiences I've had throughout my scientific journey, they've all been very positive.
Well, I'm very glad to hear that. And then after you did your PhD in physics and then some postdoctoral research, what were some of your main takeaways from that experience, and how do you feel that it has shaped the way that you view and solve problems?
To best answer that, I can give a little bit of context of the main subject of my PhD research.
Sure.
So during my PhD, my main project was about studying the physiology of the electric eel. I think probably many people have heard of the electric eel. It's really an incredible organism that is capable of generating huge amounts of electricity, which it uses to shock its prey or defend itself. And when you start to think about it a little bit, it's really an incredible feat that it's able to accomplish, because it's able to create this huge amount of power, essentially, from within its own body. And that's something that is very rare throughout nature, and really incredible that it was able to sort of, through evolution, become capable of using its physiological environment within the body to create this energy that it's able to use for its own purposes. And so we as researchers were really interested in trying to see whether we could understand exactly on like a molecular level how the eel is capable of creating this electricity, and then seeing if we could translate that into a sort of synthetic system where maybe we could use it to do something very similar to what the eel does. This is a kind of long-term, really ambitious vision, but what you could imagine is if we knew how to harness exactly the way the eel does the physiological environment within the body to create electricity, then you could potentially do that within the human body and maybe generate enough electricity to power a small medical device like a pacemaker, for example.
Wow.
In a way, what we did to answer this question was we researched the eel, tried to break it down in terms of how exactly it's capable of making the power that it does, and then using that to create our own soft battery that works almost exactly the way that the eel does.
Wow. That's amazing. How did you come up with that idea?
Well, it was quite a bit of work from beginning to end. Once you have the original idea of even thinking about whether this is possible, it starts to become a thought exercise as like, could this really be done? Is there something that the eel is capable of doing that humans just could not do? Or are there sort of underlying mechanisms that are fundamental to sort of both sides where you could find a middle ground and say, okay, the eel does it this way, and we can see some analogs in either in a synthetic environment or in the human body and try and use that as an analog and sort of draw parallels where we can. And I think that comes back to the point of your question, which is when you start to look at this kind of complex problem, which really at the beginning you might have no idea how to approach it. One of the main things that my PhD experience showed me is that no matter how complex a biological problem or any kind of problem might be, if you are able to sort of strip it down to its fundamentals, then you might be able to use that knowledge to build something new and very valuable in a way. And I found that experience to be probably throughout my scientific journey, probably the most useful one, because I think that's something that can be applied to basically any environment.
Yeah, it's very unique being able to leverage how nature works and using biomimicry to develop technology that enables us to further create things, but in a simplistic manner that's similar to nature.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, evolution has created some really incredible things. In a way, we would do ourselves a disservice if we didn't learn from that. Might not be able to create the same complexity of what evolution is able to create over millions of years, but there's definitely a lot to learn from nature.
Oh, absolutely. And that leads nicely into some parallels between the alternative protein sector. So I'm very curious to learn about your transition from that work to the alternative protein sector.
Yeah, sure. So shortly after I finished my PhD, while I was doing my postdoctoral research, I sort of realized that I wanted to try and translate my scientific skills to an application where I felt like my work could directly benefit others. A lot of scientific research can often be about making proof of concept, but not necessarily driving it all the way to a product or an application that's really doing good within the larger community or to humanity in a way. So when I was approaching the job market, I was looking at it with quite an open mind, trying to figure out what skills could I translate from my previous research experience into a different environment that met what I was looking for. And I really feel like I found the perfect fit at Multus, where working in the alternative protein industry is kind of a really interesting field because it's so rapidly growing. There's so many different technical, scientific, production related challenges that for somebody who enjoys solving problems, it's like the perfect area to invest my time and efforts into. And it's a field with very noble goals, as I'm sure all of you and your listeners will be very aware. And also, Multus, we have a vision of approaching biological problems with a very technical and data driven mindset. And I felt like that was basically made for me, especially based on all the research that I had done up to that point.
Right. Okay. And can you provide a little more context on what Multus is and what its mission is and what the company culture is like there?
Yeah, absolutely. So Multus is a company dedicated to developing growth media for the cultivated meat industry. So to provide a little bit of context for anyone who doesn't know, cultivated meat is essentially real meat made from animal cells, but essentially grown in a way where you don't have to harm or kill any animals or livestock. And in order to grow the animal cells that you use to basically create the meat, you have to feed those cells several essential components that allow them to stay happy and healthy. Now, the issue, or one of the issues within the cultivated meat industry that everybody is sort of trying to solve or figure out how to get around, is that commercial growth media that's used to feed the cells is often far too expensive. It's very unreliable, and the cultivated meat industry basically needs to move away from it in order to meet the cost target that will actually make it a viable product within the market, because nobody wants to pay $100 for a burger. So essentially, what Multus is doing is delivering cheaper alternatives to commercial growth media, specifically for the cultivated meat industry, so that we can make the industry as a whole as successful as possible.
Right. Okay. That's so interesting. So you're like a business to business company for other cultivated meat companies, then, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Very fascinating. So, can you describe specifically what your day to day at Multus looks like?
Well, I'm the head of the formulation team at Multus, which is essentially an R&D division that's focused on designing the growth media that we market to cultivated meat companies. So, what that looks like on a day to day basis is basically a lot of brainstorming where we have a lot of challenges that we have to address in order to create the best formulations that are both working well and performing well for cultivated meat companies, but also cheap enough to meet the cost targets of the industry as a whole. So we're basically constantly engaged in really interesting and deep scientific discussions on how to address all the challenges that we're facing. And then I basically have discussions between me and my really amazing team about how to address those challenges, and then designing tests and experiments to basically help us get to where we need to be.
And what do you enjoy the most about that sort of work?
Well, I think that for me, being able to have, like I mentioned, these incredible, very technical discussions on a day to day basis is just perfect for me. I'm definitely the kind of person who enjoys that problem solving aspect of science, and I think I get a lot of that in this kind of role. I also really enjoy the collaborative nature of the environment that we've created at Multus. It's really one where, unlike academia, where you're often working either by yourself or with one other person on a very isolated project, here, everybody in the company, whether they're on my team or within another team throughout Multus, we're all focused on very similar goals and working together to achieve all the goals that we have as a company. And that kind of environment, it requires a lot of coordination, a lot of discussion between a lot of different parties, but it's also an incredibly rewarding environment where when you are able to work together and accomplish a certain goal, you feel that it's basically everybody's success and everybody is able to sort of celebrate together the achievements that we're able to create. So I really enjoyed that kind of environment, and it makes me feel like this type of environment is exactly where I want to be for the rest of my career.
And on that note, what are your long term career goals or aspirations?
Yeah, so I think that this is something I'm starting to think about a little bit more now. I mean, up to this point, I've been in this position for a couple of years, and a lot of that time was, in a way, getting really comfortable in this type of environment, making sure that I really understand the industry from front to back and feel like now I'm at the point where I can contribute exactly what I want to this field. I think the cultivated meat and alternative protein industries are the type of place that I want to be. So I think in the long run, I would really love to continue to stay in this field and basically build on the experience that I've had so far at Multus to make sure that I can service this industry as best I can. I feel like this is, in a way, more than just my own career aspirations. I know that this work is valuable, and regardless of what form or position that takes moving forward, I think that this is exactly where I want to contribute all of my efforts to. And I think it would be very gratifying if by the end of my career I could look back and say alternative proteins, cultivated meat has been a huge success and I was able to contribute to that.
Right. What is it about the alternative protein sector that really makes you passionate about it and feel that it's a great impact and that you want to contribute to it?
Well, I think a lot of it comes back to the climate crisis. I mean, it just seems at this point that climate change is something that we can't ignore. Not that it ever was. And given that, there's tons of different ways that people can make an impact. Originally, I thought for me it might be in medicine or some other field. But with a problem as big as climate change, it's something that where I know my time spent here isn't going to be wasted in a way. This is a problem that is a huge challenge for humanity. And I think that's honestly, that's basically it. I just want to be doing something where I don't look back and say, oh, this didn't really make any kind of impact. And this is a place where I feel very confident that that's going to be the case here.
Okay. And what makes you so confident about cultivated meat, in particular for being a viable climate change solution?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I mean, for the cultivated meat industry, I think it's a little bit at an in between phase where there's been a lot of promise in the early stages in terms of what it could achieve, in terms of making sure that we don't need to rely on livestock, don't need to have these mass cultivation farms that are terrible for the environment, and on top of that, very unethical. I think the translation of that promise into really making the impact that I think we all want to make is something that is an incredible challenge. So I'm not going to sit here and say, I know for a fact that we're going to, as an industry, be able to achieve everything that we want to achieve. But what I can say with incredible confidence is that this problem is one that requires solving. It's a very important issue that if we ignore, it's only going to get worse. And the other thing I know as a scientist is that if we don't make the effort now to accomplish this goal, or if we don't try as hard as we can, it's never going to happen. Now, you don't get to know in advance how successful everything's going to be, but you still have to make the effort. And that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, the animal agriculture sector is such a big issue in terms of global greenhouse gas emissions, land use, water use, pollution, land aggregation, deforestation, all these problems. And if there's a chance that cultivated meat can replace that and solve some of these issues, it's definitely worth giving it a shot.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so now I want to transition to career advice and provide some insights for our listeners. So, have there been any resources or mentors that have been quite useful to you in your journey?
Yeah, so in my scientific journey, I think my mentors in the different research environments that I've worked in have been incredible in shaping me into the scientist that I am right now. And I think, as sort of general advice to anybody who's approaching a scientific field or thinking about doing a PhD or working in a research lab, it's really hard to overstate how important your mentor and your relationship with your mentor is to your ability to grow and develop as a scientist. From that perspective, I've basically had some really great research environments that have taught me a lot. During my undergraduate research, my advisors, their names are Tony Tong and Lei Yin, they really, in a way, taught me what it means to be a scientist. And that was at a time where I literally knew nothing about science. And they built up my knowledge from the ground up and instilled in me confidence that I could do research at a high level. And then similarly, my PhD advisor, Michael Meyer, he heightened that sense of confidence and also taught me how deep you have to sometimes dig into a problem before you can really start to solve it. And again, that's an incredibly valuable lesson because sometimes you think that a problem is unsolvable until you really give it the time and effort that it deserves. And then sometimes you'll find that it's actually not as problematic as you may have thought. Lastly, I want to shout out all of the leadership at Multus who have been really fantastic as well. I mean, they've guided me into an industry that I really didn't know very much about at the beginning and an environment that was quite unfamiliar to me and have been really great at helping me with that transition and, yeah, making it an incredible place to work.
Oh, that's fantastic. I'm glad they've cultivated a great work environment there, pun intended. And so, what advice do you have for job seekers in the alternative protein space?
I can probably here speak mostly to the cultivated meat industry specifically.
Sure.
Within the cultivated meat industry, there's a lot of challenges that need to be addressed, and they're in a lot of different spaces. There's the scientific challenges that I mostly am working on, but there's many others from an operational level, production level, making sure that when we have products that are in the cultivated meat space that we need to scale to meet the demands of the industry to actually make an impact, that we're capable of doing those processes effectively and making sure that all of this can reach the end goal, which is being able to have cultivated meat as a reliable and cost effective alternative to the real thing. So, because there's so many of these different challenges, it means that people with a lot of different types of expertise can and should be looking at the cultivated meat industry as a place where they could apply their skills. I think in general, the way I approached it is, I think, something that might be useful for others is thinking about your own skills and your own drive and seeing if that aligns with the cultivated meat industry. I mean, I imagine a lot of your listeners will have the drive in place already. They know that this is an important field that is worth their effort and time. So then I think it becomes more about thinking, what am I good at? What skills do I have, or what skills do I want to build? And then there's a ton of companies out there who are growing, currently looking for people. Even if you don't have as much experience as I did going in, like if you haven't done a PhD, there are entry level positions as well where you can grow and learn on the job. And if you're able to understand the motivation of the industry and understand what skills can be useful within it, then I think you can sell yourself as, I know what's important. I may not have all the skills right now, but I know how we can get there and willing to go on that journey to make it happen.
From my understanding, the cultivated meat industry is in its very early stages and is mainly R&D, and it's primarily scientists and maybe a few engineers working on it. Is that your understanding as well, that it's mainly those types of roles that companies are looking for, or are there other roles that are available in the cultivated meat sector specifically?
Yeah, I think it varies quite a bit. I mean, there are many early stage companies who are trying to get off the ground, make their products, develop their products, and in those companies oftentimes there's definitely a lot of R&D, but even in smaller companies as they grow to maybe the stage where Multus is right now, there can be quite a few other areas that even small companies find useful, such as business development or considering bioprocessing, making sure that operations are scalable, looking at the production strategies that the companies are using. And then there's also quite a few bigger companies as well that have, in a way, not progressed past R&D, but are shifting their focus from primarily R&D to addressing actual production, supply chain type issues. So I think that while, yes, in a way, the field is at an early stage, I think it's beginning to transition more and more where you can find a bit of a balance. And I think depending on your skills, it's definitely worth looking at just because there are so many different opportunities out there.
Yeah, that's good to hear. And I'm glad you were able to share some more insights for non-science and engineering roles within that sector.
Mm-hmm.
And is Multus actively hiring? And if so, what types of roles and where should people apply?
Yeah, so this actually transitions pretty nicely from the question about non-scientists because Multus recently launched the world's first production facility dedicated to making growth media at scale for the cultivated meat industry.
Oh, wow.
And so this is a plant where we are planning on scaling the media that we as a company within the R&D sector are developing for the industry as a whole and making sure that we can meet the demands that are definitely coming as we grow and as the industry grows. So in order to fill that out, we need manufacturing process engineers, which are kind of essential to making sure that we can run that environment effectively. We're also constantly adding new opportunities in R&D and operations as well. So I think it's important to just take a look, check every once in a while on our website at multus.bio/careers. We have a list of our open positions and we're constantly checking and posting new things. So basically, if you feel like you might be a good fit, take a look. And even if there isn't a position that you think fits exactly your skill set, there's also contacts that you can make where you can just send quick email, a CV, and discuss what you're interested in. And that can be another way to get involved.
Okay, yeah, that's definitely always a great avenue for job seekers is that general application form for companies where sometimes companies don't necessarily know exactly what they need, and then the perfect candidate comes along and shares their experience and what they're able to bring to the company, and the company's like, hey, actually we could really benefit from someone with that skill set, and they just didn't think that they would need that until someone comes across them.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
And as we come to the end of the podcast here, is there anything else that you wanted to talk about or discuss or mention?
No, I just think worth mentioning that it's really great what you're doing for the industry. I think that this is a really valuable service in a way to spread the love, make sure that people hear about this industry and can get involved if they're interested, because like I've mentioned here, there's quite a bit of opportunity and also need so that we can make this as successful as possible.
Oh, for sure. And I appreciate your kind words, and I say the same for you. It's been great to have you on the show, and I really want to thank you for taking the time to share your insights, and hopefully some listeners will benefit from it and be able to get a career in the alternative protein sector.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure.
I want to state that Anirvan's story is not as uncommon as you may think, as there are numerous people who work in the alternative protein industry who never foresaw that they would be working in it, but once they discovered it, they realized that they had finally found their calling. This is true with myself, as well as many other guests on this podcast. This is why there's a place for everyone, including you, to be a part of the alternative protein revolution. If you're looking for a job that builds the future of food, creates positive impact, and drives scientific innovation, then you should check out the relaunched version of Talis' website, which was redesigned to help job seekers find a job in the alternative protein industry even more efficiently. If you want to learn more about careers in the alternative protein industry, please follow the Cultivating Careers in Alternative Proteins podcast on Instagram for weekly posts about episode releases, alternative protein resources, job boards, career advice, and so much more.